Hello and welcome to CrosB2B Tech 360. I'm your host, Mike Crosby. I'm the B2B analyst for NPD. This is the first of a regular podcast series providing tech trends, insights, and opinions surrounding all things business to business. In today's podcast, we'll be spending some time looking at the general B2B landscape and some of the factors impacting the recovery. We'll then look at sector verticals and their first half performance, along with some thoughts surrounding the second half, and then finally, we'll do a high-level review of the current state of the U.S. supply chain and in general how availability across major categories is playing out during the first half of 2021 and what's likely to occur during the second half. So let's get started. To provide some context to some of today's content, I wanted to begin with the general B2B landscape and some key takeaways. So first of all, and I think this one is fairly clear to everyone, that all sectors were impacted differently during the pandemic and are also recovering at different rates. And that's something that we continue to see now. There is some commonality on improvement. However, you do see some pretty good variability depending on the types and classification of each of the sectors. Another nice thing that really is happening after the first half, we saw collectively a float all boats kind of performance where we saw all sectors improved and basically combined to a 13% year-over-year increase in revenue. Even though we saw some pretty severely impacted sectors that ended 2020, again, we saw reasonable performance as the economy began to improve, people were going back to work, and we saw vaccination rates increase, and we saw infection rates decline. We certainly saw some improvement there. The other thing that was interesting is the sectors that have high customer proximity, or there's a high concentration of people, we actually saw those improve faster than anticipated in the first half. Typically where we saw, because of what was going on with COVID, that we saw those impacted pretty severely, but certainly, again, as economies improved, back to work improved, and change in status of what was going on with COVID, we actually saw that improve faster. There are still some challenges. I think ahead, as we know, there's still continuing headwinds around shortages of raw materials, lower finished goods inventory, and higher logistics costs are still impacting the ability to meet this higher level or accelerated demand. A lot of that is a really cause and effect that as before the shutdown was effective, there was a lot of deleveraging and a lot of liquidation of inventory, and it depleted it down to a very low level. Then as businesses began to return, there was no base of inventory available, and we saw that really fall behind very quickly. And because it's been, again, more demand than supply, we ultimately continue to see this period of catch-up, which is still going to run well into 2022 as the expected. And lastly, while the recovery is robust, I mean, that 13% increase I think was nice, it's still kind of fragile. And again, the question of the Delta variant and other challenges may ultimately dampen the rate of growth that we're currently seeing today. So it's something that we're going to continue to watch very closely. Let's make a pivot now, and we're going to go over to sector review. And I first just to position these sectors. This is based on NAICS, or North American Industry Classification System, and there are 20 sector verticals, and that's really what we're going to lead with and talk through today. As part of the analysis that I did on this particular set of data, it was really tied to grouping each of these based on impact. So as we looked at highest level of impact due to the pandemic, we classified those as the red. In the moderates, we classified those as yellow, and then ultimately the green were little to no negative impact tied to the pandemic, where ultimately it actually acted as a catalyst for some accelerated growth. So let's talk about some of those just as we go group by group. In the first highest impacted sectors, again, there's 8 total, and the ones that really I want to call out are the major ones. But really, this includes things like accommodation and food service, oil and gas mining, entertainment and recreation. Each 3 of those were very severely impacted with losses at the end of 2020, revenue decline nearly 30% for each of those. We had originally forecast those would stay in the first half of the year still very, very low, but we actually saw some improvement early, as I'd mentioned earlier, and it looks like momentum continues to build. It's still going to be a fairly slow process because there's still some variability in really finding labor to come back and serve some of these areas, but certainly seeing some improvement. Now, originally on this group, they were down 14% year over year. They represent a little less than 30% of the overall number. As it stands, the first half, we're actually positive 6% and representing roughly the same number, about 26% overall. Outlook now for the second half, you're looking at improvement really across the board, other than the three I'd mentioned earlier. And it actually totals up to be a green indicator that we're going to see more accelerated growth within this highest impacted sector for the second half. So again, nice recovery well underway. If you look at what are the areas where we saw a lot of contribution from product, commercial software really led the way. That was up 5%. Again, notebooks carried a significant amount of the computer lift. That was up 9%. We also saw some strength around multimedia for monitors and displays, up 15%. And we even saw some increases year over year on printers, while consumables were still in a little bit of a decline. So all in all, again, nice change in momentum, and we're moving in the right direction as we continue to move forward. Let's move to the moderate impact. There's 6 that make up this area. And again, last year they were down about 7%. And they represent a much higher percentage of the overall business, about 44%. The big 3 that were really the ones that were heavily impacted: construction, wholesale trade, and then classification as other services. What's interesting, though, about all of these that also include information and healthcare and social assistance, we've seen already improvement not only in the first half, but the second half. I'm reading all green across the board. So the nice thing, the moderates were not impacted materially due to the 2020 close, but ultimately, as we saw businesses again return and certainly saw that acceleration, we're reading green now all the way across the board. So I'm anticipating some strong growth overall for the second half. Again, the first half performance still representing about 44% of the overall business, and actually up a positive 9%. Okay. Moving to the last grouping, this is low or no impact. And again, what makes up this grouping would be education, public administration, utilities, and retail trade, all doing a very significant part of the overall business, leading with education. At the last year, end of 2020 revenue, this grouping was up 14%, represented again about the same, about 30% of the overall revenue. But we saw education last year at plus 27 being 13% of the revenue. At the end of the first half, we actually saw education now increase 41% and now representing about 14% of the overall revenue. An area that we're still seeing some areas of a little bit of decline, where it was very, very strong in the end of 2020, was public administration or government spend. It's still positive, but just above. It's a 1% growth, and again, representing about 8% of the overall business. I do believe, and again, we're anticipating growth second half, mainly due to the infrastructure package that's pending right now within the federal government. And as that gets approved here over the next few weeks, that's likely to see a nice influx of dollars to be spent on budget, and that number should come up pretty significantly. What's interesting on the category performance on this particular area, computers dominated the way. Up 41% was computer software, ranked second, up 10. Again, displays with the attach that was going with computers, up 51% as well. So again, anticipating all green on this last grouping, and with strong anticipation of some good growth. Okay. Let's go lastly now, the last topic I want to talk about was supply chain and in general some outlook. I did find a most recent graphic that was courtesy of the U.S. Census Bureau, and it actually lays out inventory, days of sales and inventory on where we sit today, and it shows back through 1992, and we are at the significantly lower than the lowest point previously up until 92. We're sitting somewhere between 33 and 34 days of sales that we have in finished goods inventory. Again, how is this caused and where we sit? It's a lot of things, as we talked about. If you look at kind of on the recovery side of this, the combination of labor shortages and recovery-driven accelerated demand is kind of exacerbating the supply chain recovery even more so. As I talked earlier, we saw depletion of supply, and ultimately we saw that demand rush in, and we've been yet to be able to catch back up in where we sit, and now it's actually flowed upstream, where now we're starting to see some impacts on raw materials. Unfortunately, this depleted supply chain recovery is still likely to continue well into 2022. So we've seen, and we will talk about here in a minute, what are some of the core categories and where do we see some of those changes actually occurring. We talked a little bit about what caused it. Again, supply chain was unable to respond kind of after the initial impact, and a lot of their resources and inventories were reduced just to deleverage and to manage down costs. But the problem was when the demand came back during the recovery, it just was not able to meet that current level of elevated demand. And lastly, talk a little bit about the U.S. and ports specifically. We measure pretty frequently, again, kind of as a proxy, West Coast ports, specifically around Port of LA and Long Beach. And we're continuing to see challenges around some key areas. Certainly one is shortages of containers in general within the supply chain. And that continues to be a challenge. And it's really less about actually not having enough. It's really that they're in the wrong places. That as inventory was coming in and being offloaded from ships from Asia, these ships would turn and sail, and because they weren't able to turn the containers fast enough, they piled up mainly in areas where we didn't need to have empty containers. So the challenge is there's a balancing issue that's continuing to really nag, I think, the ability to get more efficient, more effective. It's also we still have shortages of labor, and we certainly have shortages of trucks, and a lot of those continue to contribute to not only delays of getting additional inventory into the marketplace, but also higher costs at the same time. In fact, I saw a most recent statistic that said now freighting a container is as high as it was in 2008 during the Great Recession. So lastly, if we talk specifically about some of the areas, I put together a listing and we'll be able to share with you on request, top 12 categories that basically make up this area, and I'll only talk about the ones that are really challenged. But if you look at it between notebooks, video cards, CPU chips, and monitors, and even now including docking stations, you're looking at an improvement going from red to yellow all the way out post Q1 of 2022. And in fact, we're still looking at video cards and CPUs still being pretty severely constrained out through June. By the first half, ultimately on where we see it, there'll still be at best probably moderate availability with a handful showing up that would be better. But certainly at the end of the first half, beginning of the second half, we should start to see much improvement and get majority of these top 12 categories back into the good range. So with that, I just wanted to close and say again, thanks for listening, and we're looking forward to sharing with you other content addressing other challenges or other issues that are out there. Please, we'd love to hear from you and understand what our other topics are relative to your business and what information you'd like us to share. We'll also be having guests from time to time to talk about different aspects of the business, and I look forward to sharing that information with you here at a future date. Thanks all for attending, and we much appreciate it.